Welcome back. Today's story filled with drama and unexpected turns. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump in.
3 years back, I found out my wife, Megan, was cheating on me. It led to a heated fight, and I decided to leave the house for good. I wasn't leaving because of the argument, I just couldn't stay with someone who had betrayed me. For me, our marriage was over the moment she let someone else into her life. I checked into a motel near the downtown area. It was kind of rundown, but it would do until I found something more permanent. I put the 2 suitcases I had packed into my room and walked to a nearby neighborhood bar intent on getting drunk and drowning my sorrows. By walking, I would not risk a DWI. The place I chose was pretty much empty due mainly to the fact it was a Saturday evening. There were 2 couples sitting at tables and 1 older man sitting at the bar nursing on a bottle of beer. I found a booth over on the far wall away from anyone else. I was not in the mood for conversation. The bored-looking waitress came over, and I ordered a shot of Jack and a beer. By the time I had finished my second round, I had had enough time to do a little thinking. I realized that I could either sit around feeling sorry for myself, or I could do what I normally do and meet this problem head-on. I was a home builder specializing in upscale homes, and it was at the height of the housing boom. I would always have 2 or 3 houses in progress at any one time, and when construction problems arose, I learned that it would cost me money if I did not tackle them right away. With new resolve, I returned to the motel for a fitful night of sleep. The next morning, I went to the bank and moved all our money from our joint accounts into one in my name only in order to protect myself. Next, I canceled all our joint credit cards, keeping 2 that were in my name only and the ones that I had set up for my business. My final stop of the day was to my lawyer to draw up divorce papers. Jason was a friend of mine as well as my lawyer, and even though he specialized in real estate law, his wife, Natalie, who was a lawyer and his partner, dealt in family law. After they both told me how sorry they were at the circumstances I found myself in, we sat down to go over the details. I was given the usual spiel, telling me how this was a community property state and that Megan was going to be entitled to 2/3 of everything and that I would be responsible for paying child support. I told them I was well aware of that, but there was no way I was going to change my mind and to proceed with the paperwork because of our daughter. I filed for dissolution on the grounds of irreconcilable differences rather than adultery. I had done well in my business, and even having to give her 2/3 would still leave me well off. I just wanted to rid myself of a faithless wife. I slept better that night, knowing that I was now taking charge of the situation. It was Tuesday evening, the second full day after I had packed my bags and left, that I received a call from my daughter, Sophie, who was 14 at the time, telling me that she had not seen or heard from her mother since she got home from school and she was all alone and hungry. Cursing my soon-to-be ex, I jumped into my truck and headed home. I consoled my distraught daughter, then headed into the kitchen to fix her something to eat. It was under a magnet on the refrigerator that I saw an envelope with my name on it in my wife's handwriting. As curious as I was to see what was inside, I tossed it on the counter to read later and continued to make dinner for Sophie. It was only after we had eaten and watched a little TV and I had put Sophie to bed that I returned to the kitchen. I picked up the envelope and went into the den. I poured myself a shot of bourbon and downed it and sat down to read whatever was inside. It was a note from Megan, in which she said that I was crazy if I thought I was going to saddle her with a child to raise. It went on to say that she was leaving and for me not to bother looking for her. To say I was stunned is an understatement. I realized I had never really known the woman I had married. I just could not understand how in the hell a mother could abandon her child. I went up to what had been our bedroom and saw that most of her clothes and personal items were gone. I waited until the next morning to call Jason and Natalie to talk over this new development and find out how it was going to affect my attempt to divorce Megan. Natalie advised me to wait until Tuesday, and then she would accompany me to my wife's place of work. She would have the divorce papers drawn up, and we could have her served there. The hardest thing was sitting down with Sophie to talk to her about what was going on. She already knew that her mother and I were having problems since I hadn't been home for the previous 2 nights. I decided that being honest with her was for the best, and I told her that her mother had left a note saying that she was leaving. Other than that, I really could not answer her questions about when she would come back, as I did not know myself. We managed to get through the weekend, and Tuesday morning, I fed Sophie her breakfast and dropped her off at school. I drove to Megan's place of work, where I met up with Natalie. Together, we went inside to inquire if my wife was there. At the mention of Megan's name, we were directed to the staffing department, where we learned that she and her boss had both turned in their resignations the previous Wednesday. Somehow, I was not all that surprised, as I had found out that the man she had been having the affair with was her boss. Her boss was foolish enough to have a sexual relationship with an employee under his direction, but was smart enough to realize that when I made an issue of it, he was going to lose his job for breaking company policy against fraternization between a manager and an employee under their supervision. Once outside in the parking lot, Natalie advised me that it would be in my best interest to file a missing persons report with the police, as she had been gone for over 48 hours. They would be obliged to take the report and, with any luck, find her. She followed me down to the police station, where a detective took my statement that Megan was missing. I was honest with him and told him that the reason I wanted to find her was so I could have her served with divorce papers and the reason for the divorce. I showed him the note she had left and told him what we had learned about her and her lover quitting their jobs. He wanted to know if I had an alibi for the Wednesday she was last seen, and I assured him that I had spent the whole day at one of the houses I was building, and there were several contractors who could verify that. At the end, the cop told me that if they determined that there was no foul play involved and she had left of her own volition, there was not too much they could do. I then offered to buy Natalie lunch, and we called her husband and met up at a nearby restaurant. We requested a table that was fairly private so we could talk. "So, Natalie, what does this do as far as the divorce if we can't find her to have her served?" I asked. "What that means in this state is you are going to have to wait for a year before you can file on the grounds of abandonment." "I'm sorry, Ethan, but that's what the law states," Natalie answered. "The reason I wanted you to report her missing is so that we have an official report of when she left to document it. Other than that, if the police don't locate her, your only other option, if you want to pursue it, is to hire a private agency to try to track her down." "Well, I guess that gives me something to think about. I guess I'll wait until I hear from the police. Honestly, though, I don't know if I even want to know where she's gone, as I'm in no hurry to get married again, if ever. I guess waiting a year isn't that big of a deal as long as I don't have to deal with her." I could see the look of sympathy in Natalie's eyes when I said I was not looking to get married again. She reached over and patted my hand. "Ethan, I know how tough this is on you, and I know you're hurting right now, but as your friend, please promise me that you're not going to cut yourself off from life. For now, my focus is on Sophie. I'm sure she is even more shocked and hurt than I am. I have to be there for her." Jason and Natalie both nodded their understanding and told me they were both there for me and would help any way they could. After lunch, I went by one of my job sites and checked up on the progress and then went to Sophie's school to wait for her to get out. As she exited the building, I saw her looking around almost frantically until she saw my truck, upon which she came running as fast as she could. I stepped out, and she flung herself into my arms. I could feel her shaking. "I was afraid you would not be here," she sniffled into my neck, where she had buried her face. "Oh, baby, I promise I'm not going anywhere," I answered, hugging her tight to me. "Do you really promise?" she asked, staring at me with her big brown eyes shimmering with tears. "Yes, honey, I really promise." I kissed her forehead and carried her around to the passenger side of the truck and seat-belted her in. I again cursed my wife as I walked around to get in. With a little prodding, I finally got Sophie to open up about her school day on the drive home. Once home, Sophie would not let me out of her sight. I continued to do my best to reassure her that I was not going to abandon her. Despite that, she began to have nightmares, and I would wait to hear her sobbing in her sleep. I would rush to her room, and when I would awaken her, she would throw her arms around me and hang on as if for dear life. When I asked her what she was dreaming about, she said that she was lost, and she could not find either her mother or me. The biggest saving grace I had at this time was my office manager. I had hired Laura to help me with the many mundane aspects of my work, such as filing for permits and arranging for inspections, so as to free me up to concentrate on the more demanding tasks. Since then, I had come to totally rely on her. She now worked to keep the subcontractors on schedule and ordering and tracking materials, as well as handling all the necessary paperwork. I might go several days without stopping in at the office, but I never worried about it, as I knew Laura was able to handle it. I had such trust in her that I even had her make out the checks to pay the subs or vendors. All I had to do was stop in on Wednesday and sign them, and then she would see to it they got delivered. When I had decided I needed help running my business, I had put out an ad in the local paper and had begun to interview people. I was getting discouraged with the respondents and could not find anyone who had the qualifications I felt were needed to handle the job. That was until Laura applied for the job. I still remember the day she walked in the door. Even though I was married, I still recognized a good-looking woman when I saw one. She stood only 5 feet 4 inches, but she had such lovely big brown eyes and a cute button of a nose. I judged her to be in her mid-30s, and she obviously kept herself in shape by what I could see. She wore a blue business suit that, even though it was not revealing, did little to hide her trim figure. The interview went well, and I was impressed by her qualifications. She had worked for her father, who owned a construction company, and was well-versed in the business. When I asked her why she no longer worked for him, she explained to me that her husband had been transferred here, so they had to move away. I also learned that she had a daughter the same age as my Sophie, and now that she was in school, Laura wanted to return to the workforce. We reached an agreement on wages, and I had an office manager. Now, don't get the wrong idea, nothing ever happened between the two of us, not even flirting on my part. That was because I was married and took my vow seriously, and even if I was not married, she was. I have a firm rule that I never mess with another man's woman. For her part, it was obvious she loved her husband very, very much and was not the type of woman to mess around. I had let Laura know about what was going on with my marriage, and when I told her about the nightmares that Sophie was having, she immediately suggested that I should put her in therapy. I quickly realized she was right, and together we found a therapist who was willing to work with us. I had chosen a woman therapist because I believed that it would put Sophie more at ease, as she had always been extremely shy around men she did not know. I met with Dr. Morgan to tell her about all the things that had happened and why I felt it was necessary for her to see Sophie. We set up a schedule to meet twice a week, and she let me know that it would be good if I were to be available, as she would want to see us together at times and just Sophie alone at others. Another event that happened in the meantime was that the day after I had made a missing persons report, the police sent over a woman detective to talk to Sophie. My daughter told them that the last time she had seen her mother was Wednesday morning before she left for school and that her mother had seemed distracted, but Sophie hadn't been all that concerned at the time. It was a week later that I was asked to come down to the station and meet with the detective I had first talked with. He said their investigations had tracked her lover's credit card usage to 2 motels, and they had determined with the use of pictures that the two were together of their own free will. They had apparently left the state, and as there was no evidence of foul play, the police weren't going to pursue the case any further. The next 2 months passed, and the therapy seemed to be working for my daughter. I believe that she finally understood that it was in no way her fault that her mother had left, but more importantly, that I would always be there for her. The frequency of her nightmares had dropped off, and she no longer had to keep me in sight whenever we were together. Laura and her husband began to invite Sophie and me to their house for barbecues. At first, I was hesitant to accept, but Laura convinced me that it would be good for Sophie to spend time with her daughter doing normal girl things. I knew her husband, Chris, from having met him at different times, but I was a little concerned about how he would take his wife inviting a man, even if it were her boss, into their home. I quickly found that my worries were for nothing. He and I quickly bonded and became friends, and my Sophie and their daughter, Chloe, also quickly bonded and became best friends. Not only that, but Laura, being a loving mother, made sure to spend time with both girls, giving Sophie what I felt was much-needed motherly guidance. Megan had been gone for 2 2/3 months with no word from her, and I decided it was time to rid my bedroom of the last vestiges of her former presence. Although she had apparently packed a lot of her clothes and personal effects, she had still left stuff behind. I brought a couple of large garbage bags up and started going through her drawers, emptying out her belongings. In the last drawer, which was mostly sweaters, I found a small box tucked into the back. Being curious, I opened it up and gasped when I saw what was inside. There was a baggie with at least 1/4 ounce of pot in it and a vial of white powder. Now, I was not naive about drugs. In my younger days, before I married Sophie's mother, I had done some experimenting myself but put that aside when I graduated college and got serious about life. I opened the vial and sniffed at it before taking a little powder on my finger and tentatively tasting it. Cocaine. The only other thing in there was a CD. I turned on my computer and put in the disc to see if there was anything on it that I could access. I saw that it contained a movie, so I opened it with the movie player and was surprised to see that it was obviously shot in the basement. I had built the house we lived in and had the basement set up with exercise equipment on one side, and the other was basically a game room with a pool table, plush couches, and a large-screen TV. The scene showed 4 couples sitting or standing, most with drinks in their hands. 2 of those people were Megan and her boss. I advanced the movie forward, and at this point, I saw people passing around joints while others were snorting lines of white powder off the glass top of the coffee table. Once again, I forwarded the movie, and this time it showed Megan engaged in intimate acts with multiple partners. I have always had a strong sex drive and occasionally watched some adult content when my wife was not receptive to my advances. I know there are men out there who get off on seeing their wives with other men, but I'm not one of those. All I felt was a great upheaval in my stomach, and I raced for the bathroom. I would like to say that I made it to the toilet, but alas, my vomit spewed forth across the floor. I did finish emptying my stomach in the toilet and then sat there in a daze for a while. Finally, I pulled myself together and headed to get a mop to clean up the mess. On the way out, I saw the movie was still playing on my computer. Without looking at the screen, I quickly shut it down. After I had everything cleaned up, I called Natalie. "Hey, Natalie, it's Ethan. Got time to talk?" "Ethan, Jason, and I always have time for you." "What's up?" she replied. "Well, I decided to get rid of some of Megan's stuff that is just taking up space, and in one of her drawers, I found a box with drugs and a CD. I was wondering if I should call the police and report the drugs. Honestly, I don't think that would be a good idea. The drugs are in your house, and if it came down to it, it would be your word against hers as to who they belong to. I really think you would be best off getting rid of them." "Wow, I did not really consider that," I said. "How about the CD?" "I put it in my computer, and it's a movie of her and her friends doing drugs and having group activities. That woman had an orgy in my basement." "Oh, God, Ethan, I'm sorry. I know that you would never have wanted to see that. However, since it was filmed in your home, it could be used as admissible evidence in court, especially if it came down to a matter of custody. I would suggest you hide it somewhere secure in case it's needed." "That's what I was hoping you would say. I intend to try to do anything I can to keep her away from Sophie." "So, how are things really going?" Chris asked me on our 4th visit to their house. The girls were out of earshot, busy preparing lunch inside. "I guess things are as well as could be expected when you find out your wife is into drugs and group activities," I answered. "What?" Chris said, looking shocked. I went on to tell him about the CD and drugs I had found. I guess I never really knew her. The woman I thought I had married would never have done something like that. "You don't know how lucky you are to have a woman like Laura." "Actually, I do. Not a day goes by that I don't thank my lucky stars that she chose me to love. She's a beautiful woman, and I know guys hit on her, but I have always trusted her to do the right thing. Now if I could just get her boss to stop hitting on her," Chris said with a mischievous grin just as I was taking a drink. I could not help but splutter, spitting my drink down my front. My head swiveled to look at him. "Jesus, Chris, you don't think I would ever make a pass at Laura?" I choked out. Then I noticed the twinkle in his eyes, and he burst out laughing. "Relax, buddy. Laura tells me everything about your relationship. That's why she enjoys working for you so much. You treat her with total respect, and she knows you'd never do anything to abuse her trust." I grinned back at him. "Yeah, well, it's a rule I've always lived by. Not only have I never made a play for a married woman, but I won't even make one if I know the woman has a boyfriend. If you were able to take a woman away from the men she was with, how could you ever trust her not to do the same thing with the next guy that came along? That's even more true now that it's happened to me." One other thing that happened as a result of finding the disc was that at the meeting with the therapist following my discovery, Dr. Morgan could tell that something dramatic had happened. She asked to see me the following day without Sophie. I must say, Dr. Morgan knew her business. It didn't take her long to ferret out of me what had happened, and the next thing I knew, I was having one-on-one sessions with her. It took a couple of months for her to help me realize I had been suppressing many of my true feelings and another couple of months to help me come to terms with them and deal with it. In the end, she truly helped both Sophie and me to get past this ordeal. When a year had gone by, Natalie filed my petition for divorce. We had no reason to present the CD movie, as Megan's desertion of her family and failure to make any contact with her daughter or me was sufficient justifiable cause for the court to grant the divorce and give me sole custody of my daughter. I still kept the movie hidden away as insurance in case Megan ever did return and filed for custody. Just when things seemed to have settled out for everyone, the next tragedy struck our lives. Chris was an avid cyclist and even rode in amateur races. During a race, there was a pile-up, and Chris suffered a deep thigh bruise. What no one knew at the time was that he had developed a blood clot, which later broke loose and lodged in his brain, causing a massive stroke. When it happened, we were at work. I was sitting in my office reviewing the plans for a new house I was getting ready to build when the phone call came. I heard Laura answer the phone, and suddenly I heard her cry out. I rushed to her side, and she had a frantic look as she stared at me. "It's Chris, they've rushed him to the hospital," she blurted out as she stood and grabbed her purse. She started to run out of the office, and I chased after her. "Come on, get in my truck, I'll drive," I said when I caught up with her. At first, she gave me a blank stare, then nodded and let me lead her. I put her in the passenger side and hurried to get behind the wheel. Except for telling me which hospital, she never said another word for the rest of the ride. Whenever I glanced over at her, I could see her shaking with worry. When we reached the hospital, I pulled up in front of the emergency entrance, and she leapt from the truck and rushed in. I quickly found a parking spot and ran back to the doors. When I went inside, I saw that Laura had already inquired about Chris, and she was clearly distraught. I went to her, and she looked at me, telling me that the doctors were working on him but didn't know anything yet. I put my arm around her and led her over to the waiting area to sit with her. After 2/3 an hour, I realized it was getting close to time to pick up our daughters at school. Not wanting to leave Laura alone, I called Natalie and gave her a brief rundown of what was happening, asking if she could pick up the girls from school and bring them to the hospital. She assured me she would. I then called the school to have the girls ready for pickup. Natalie called just before they arrived, and I told Laura they were here. I went out to meet them and asked Natalie to take Sophie with her and keep Laura company while I talked with Chloe. I took Chloe to a quiet spot and gently told her that her father had been brought to the hospital and was in the emergency room with the doctors. I let her know that it was apparently serious, but we would have to wait to hear more from the doctors to know the extent. Chloe tried her best to put on a brave face and followed me back to the waiting room. I thanked Natalie for her help, and before she left, I promised to call her if we needed any more help. For the next 2/3 hour, we sat in silence, me hugging Sophie and Laura holding Chloe. Finally, a nurse came out, asked us to follow her, and led us to a private sitting room. Soon, a doctor joined us. The news was grim. Although Chris was still alive, he was being kept that way by life support. Laura collapsed in tears, and I held her in my arms as she sobbed. We continued to wait until they had Chris placed in the ICU, and then Laura and Chloe were allowed to see him. After some time, Laura and Chloe came back out. "Ethan, would you look after Chloe for me?" "I'm going to stay here," Laura asked me. Chloe started to protest, so I knelt in front of her. "Sweetie, you need to be strong for your mom right now. You come home with Sophie and me, and I'll bring you back in the morning. If anything happens, your mom will call us, okay?" With tears falling from her eyes, Chloe nodded. She hugged her mother and then went to hold hands with Sophie. I gave Laura a hug and told her to call me if anything changed and that I would see her in the morning. That evening was tough. Both girls hardly ate anything and were quiet, barely speaking. I got them to bed and then turned in myself, but sleep was hard to come by. The next morning, I woke the girls and had to practically force them to eat breakfast. When I told Sophie I was going to drop her off at school, she almost had a meltdown. I took her aside, away from Chloe. "Honey, please listen to me right now. Chloe needs to be with her mom, and the time will come when she will need you too, okay?" "All right, Dad." "I understand," she replied, though it was clear she was not happy about it. "That's my girl," I said, giving her a hug. After dropping Sophie off, I took Chloe to her house. She used her key to let us in, and I had her pack her mother some fresh clothes and anything else she felt her mom might need. When we arrived at the room Chris was in, we found Laura asleep in a chair beside his bed. I set down the overnight bag we had brought, and Chloe and I went back out to the waiting room so her mom could sleep. About an hour and 2/3 later, a haggard-looking Laura came out looking for us. Chloe and I hugged her, and then I led her to the cafeteria and bought her some breakfast. It took a bit of prodding to get her to eat, but her lack of appetite was understandable. When she was finished, I went to the nurse's desk on the floor and asked if there was somewhere Laura could shower and change. The nurse, sympathetic under the circumstances, led her to the locker room. Laura returned looking somewhat better. The rest of the day was spent with Laura and Chloe taking turns sitting with Chris, while I stayed in the waiting area consoling Chloe when she was not in there. The doctors came back a little afternoon to run another battery of tests. The prognosis was not good. When it was time for school to let out, I went and picked up Sophie, and we returned to the hospital until late evening, when I took the girls home. It was 5:02 in the morning when my phone rang. I knew what it was before I even answered it. I answered the call and heard Laura's voice, strained with sorrow. "Ethan, Chris passed away." The pain in her voice was palpable, and I could only tell her how sorry I was and that the girls and I would be there as soon as possible. I quickly dressed and made my way to Sophie's bedroom. The girls were asleep in her bed, and I gently woke Sophie, putting a finger to my lips before she could speak, and beckoned her to follow me. Once in the hallway, I whispered, "Honey, Chloe's dad passed away, and Laura needs us there now. I need you to help Chloe get ready. She's going to need your support." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, accepting the responsibility. "I'll help her, Dad." I then went to wake Chloe, and, as difficult as it was, I gently told her the news. She broke down sobbing, and I held her in my arms for several minutes. With Sophie's help, she was soon dressed, and we were on our way to the hospital. When we arrived, it was heartbreaking to watch mother and daughter in a tearful embrace as they shared their grief. Sophie clung to me, crying as well. She, too, knew what it was like to lose a parent. After some time, I left the girls with Laura and Chloe, and I went to find the hospital administrators to inform them that a funeral home would contact them as soon as Laura and Chloe had chosen one. Then, I gently led Laura and Chloe out to the car and drove them home. Once there, I settled them into the den and asked Laura what phone calls needed to be made. She gave me a list, including her parents and Chris's brother. Like me, Chris's parents had already passed, and his brother was his only immediate family. I also called Jason and Natalie. At my recommendation, Laura and Chris had chosen to use Natalie as their family lawyer, and they both came over right away. Natalie stayed with Laura while I made the phone calls, including arranging with a funeral home to take charge of Chris's remains. The toll of her loss and the lack of sleep finally overcame Laura, and, with Natalie's help, she was put to bed. Afterward, I spoke with Natalie, who told me she would handle the estate matters pro bono and that she had a copy of Chris's will. She also let me know that Chris had purchased 2 burial plots for himself and Laura. I thanked Jason and Natalie for their help, and when they had left, I set about fixing lunch for the girls. The rest of the day was quiet, punctuated by bouts of tears from both Chloe and Sophie. The emotional toll soon overcame both girls, and as soon as dinner was over, they turned in. Chloe didn't want to sleep alone, so once more, both girls slept in the same bed. I decided to stay in the guest room, and after I had locked up for the night, I, too, felt the drain of energy and went to bed. Exhausted, I slept through the night. I awoke around 6 a.m. and quickly dressed, but as I left my room, the smell of coffee greeted me. I walked to the kitchen and found Laura sitting at the table, her face lined with exhaustion and grief. "Ryan, I didn't realize you were still here," she said softly. "Well, Chloe wanted Sophie to stay with her, so I decided to stay in your guest room, just in case," I replied gently. Laura gave me a grateful smile and nodded, understanding without words. I told her about the arrangements that had been made with the funeral home and that I would pick up her parents at the airport as they were flying in that day. She thanked me for everything I had done. When our daughters finally appeared, I told Laura to remain seated, and I made breakfast for everyone. Once the kitchen was cleaned, it was time for me to head to the airport. I arrived early enough to be waiting when Laura's parents came out at arrivals. Having seen their pictures before, I had no trouble recognizing them. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, I'm Ethan Cohen, Laura's friend," I said, extending my hand. "It's nice to meet you, Ethan. Please call me Thomas, and this is my wife, Vivian," Laura's father said, shaking my hand. "I feel as if I almost know you, our daughter often speaks of you very highly." "The feelings are mutual, then," I replied. "I couldn't accomplish what I do without her help. Both she and Chris have become dear friends. I just wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Vivian gave me a hug, her eyes brimming with tears. I immediately liked them both. We gathered their luggage, loaded it into the car, and I drove them to Laura's home. It was a bittersweet reunion, and more tears were shed. Sophie and I stayed for lunch, offering any support we could, before taking our leave. Chris's funeral was held the following Tuesday. Chris's brother was there, as well as many of Chris's friends, as he had been well liked for his easygoing ways and quick humor. I was also pleased to see that many of the subcontractors who had worked for me over the years and knew Laura attended to pay their respects. Laura's parents stayed for another 2 days, and on Wednesday, they invited Sophie and me over for lunch. After lunch, we adults went into the living room, while Sophie and Chloe went to Chloe's room. The conversation stayed light until Vivian spoke up. "Honey, do you know what your plans are now?" she asked Laura. "You know we would love to have you and Chloe move back home." "I know, Mom. You and Dad have always been there to support me, and I love you for that. But this has all been so sudden that Chloe and I are going to need some time to decide what to do next," Laura replied. "As soon as we know, I'll let you know." Until then, I hadn't thought about the possibility that Laura might move away. The sudden realization gave me a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach, and yet, as her friend, I would support whatever she decided. I stayed a little after 5 p.m., and before leaving, took Laura aside. "I know you need time to mourn and to think about your life now. I want you to take all the time you need. Don't worry about work, and if you do decide to move back with your parents, I want you to know I'll support your decision. You have to do what's best for you and Chloe now. In the meantime, if you need anything at all, please call. I'll always be here for you." Laura teared up and gave me a hug. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't think I would have made it this far without you." Her father followed Sophie and me out to the car and shook my hand again. "Ethan, Laura has told us how much you've done for her and Chloe through all of this. I want you to know how much Vivian and I appreciate it. I shudder to think how much worse it would have been without your support." I shook his hand firmly. "Thomas, it's the least I could do. She, Chris, and Chloe were there for me and Sophie after my wife left and abandoned our daughter. It was their love that really brought Sophie out of her depression. As long as Laura remains here, you can rely on me to look after them the best I can." Over the next 2 weeks, Sophie and I stopped by regularly to check on Laura and Chloe. She never mentioned if she had decided what she was going to do with her future, and I was content not to pry, giving her the time she needed. Chloe stayed home with her mother for the first week following the funeral, then returned to school. It was Tuesday, a week later, that I saw her car parked outside the office as I arrived for the day. When I walked in, she was sitting at her desk. I knew then that she had reached a decision. I just stood, looking at her and waiting for her to speak. "Well, boss, are you going to show me everything you messed up over the last couple of weeks so I can fix it?" she asked with a grin. "Does this mean?" "Yes," she replied with a smile. "It means we're staying. This is Chloe's home, and all her friends are here. Moving would only make this harder for her. Besides, we both know you need me to keep your business running." I exhaled a deep breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You sure know how to butter up your boss," I said with a big grin. With that settled, I caught her up on the events of the past few weeks, and she kicked me out of the office, telling me to keep an eye on the subcontractors. I don't think the smile left my face all day. Over the next year, we continued to spend almost every weekend together due to our daughter's friendship. Laura and I attended the girls' sporting events and other school activities together, and when they didn't have events, the girls would usually come to my house, and I always made sure Laura joined us. I didn't want her sitting around feeling down. Our friendship grew closer, to the point that there was nothing we couldn't talk about. Laura became a mother figure for Sophie, who had been missing that, and Chloe came to see me as a father figure. Although, whenever I tried to be the disciplinarian, the girls would giggle, and Laura would have to step in. Both girls knew they had me wrapped around their fingers, but they were good kids, so we rarely denied them anything. It was a Saturday, a little over a year after Chris passed away. I had run over to one of the houses I had under construction to handle a small crisis. When I got back home, I saw Laura's car in the driveway. We had planned a barbecue and a day of lounging by the pool. As I came into the house, I heard the girls laughing and giggling outside, so I went to the laundry room to grab my swim trunks, which I had left to dry. Normally, I'd change in my bedroom, but today I figured I'd just slip into the downstairs bathroom. With my swimsuit in hand, I opened the door to the bathroom and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in front of me was Laura, reaching for her bikini top, wearing only a skimpy pair of bikini bottoms. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen. I'd seen her in a swimsuit many times, but never like this. Laura gasped, crossing her arms across her chest, and I stammered, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." I quickly turned and shut the door behind me, hurrying to the living room. My face was flushed, and I was flustered. I hoped I hadn't ruined our friendship or embarrassed her. After about 10 minutes, Laura came out, now dressed in her bikini. She could clearly see I looked embarrassed. "Ethan, I'm really sorry. I heard the girls outside and thought you were out there with them," I said in a rush, still apologizing. She tried to look serious, but it only lasted a moment before she burst out laughing. She walked over, patted my cheek, and said, "Ethan, I know you'd never do that intentionally. Don't worry about it. Now go get changed and put the chicken on the grill. I'm hungry." I stood there, watching her walk away, letting out a sigh of relief that she wasn't mad. I quickly changed and did as she asked. When I went outside, Laura was sipping some wine as the girls splashed around in the pool. I did my best to focus on grilling and not let my mind drift back to the image of her in the bathroom, but it was challenging. After we ate, we sat back in reclining chairs, enjoying the sun. Our conversation was light and easy, just like always. During a lull in the conversation, though, Laura gave me a smirk, and I felt my face warm. She clearly remembered what had happened earlier. As the sun started to set, the girls announced they were heading over to Chloe's to have a sleepover. They gathered their things, and as they headed to the car, Laura walked up to me and gave me a kiss on the cheek with a sly smile. "Thanks for today, Ethan. See you tomorrow," she said with a grin. I watched them leave, feeling both relief and some confusion over my own reaction. Later that night, as I lay in bed, my mind drifted back to the moment I walked in on her. It was the first time since my divorce that I'd felt that kind of attraction to someone, and it left me feeling both excited and uncertain. Laura was my friend, and I didn't want to do anything to ruin that. The next week at work was a bit strange for me. I found myself staring at her more often, admiring her without even realizing it. My feelings left me confused. I hadn't thought about being with anyone in a long time, and Laura wasn't just anyone, she was my close friend and had become a big part of Sophie's life. The following Saturday, Laura and I dropped the girls off at a week-long sleepaway sports camp for girls. That evening, the local architects' circle, of which I was a member, was having their annual awards dinner. Laura was going as my guest. After the girls were settled in at camp, I dropped Laura off at her house, told her I'd pick her up at 6, and went back home to get ready. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself, doing a bit of gardening to clear my mind. Right at 6, I knocked on Laura's door, and my jaw dropped when she opened it. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress with a pearl necklace and black heels. The dress wasn't revealing, but it was stunning on her. "Wow, you look amazing," I stammered, unable to stop staring. "Thank you, kind sir," she said with a warm smile, clearly amused by my reaction. Despite the temptation to keep stealing glances, I kept my eyes on the road as we drove. Our conversation was light, as usual, and it helped calm my nerves. We arrived at the venue and joined a table with a few other builders and their spouses, where the main topic of conversation was, naturally, business. Dinner was surprisingly good, and then the awards portion of the evening began. When the award for quality of product was announced, I was pleasantly surprised to hear my name called. Laura jumped up, clapping and cheering, clearly thrilled. I kept my acceptance speech short. Thank you to the association for this honor, but most of all, I want to thank Laura. This award belongs to her as much as it does to me. If it weren't for her keeping everything organized and on track, I wouldn't be up here today. When I returned to the table, Laura was standing with tears in her eyes and gave me a tight hug, then surprised me with a quick kiss on the lips. It wasn't romantic, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. Once the awards were finished, the dance floor was cleared, and music began to play. I received congratulations from several colleagues, then turned to Laura and asked, "Would you like to dance?" She smiled and took my hand, leading me to the dance floor. The first song was an upbeat one. I wasn't much of a dancer, but Laura moved with such ease and grace that it was hard not to watch her. The next song was a slow one. I was about to lead her back to our table, but she placed her arms around my neck and moved in close. I hesitated but put my arms around her waist, and we began to sway to the music. It had been years since I'd held a woman, and holding Laura in my arms had an immediate effect on me. I could feel myself getting flustered, hoping she hadn't noticed. When the song ended, I let her precede me back to the table, grateful for the moment to calm down. Laura finished her glass of wine, then leaned over and said, "Ethan, I think a perfect way to end this evening would be to go back to your house for a soak in the hot tub." I didn't want the night to end, and the suggestion excited me. "Sounds like a great idea," I agreed, and we headed back to my place. As we drove, we talked about the award and how it could positively impact the business. Since I had a smart home setup, I used my phone to turn on the hot tub, so it would be ready by the time we arrived. When we got to the house, I fetched our swimsuits. Laura and Chloe often used the pool at my place, so they left some of their things here. She went to the bathroom to change while I quickly changed in the laundry room, grabbing a bottle of wine and 2 glasses to take outside. I was glad to already be in the tub, as the sight of Laura walking out in her bikini took my breath away. She slid into the water and accepted the glass of wine I handed her. For the first 10 minutes, we just soaked in silence, letting the warmth of the water relax us. Then Laura broke the silence, looking at me intently. "Ethan, it's been over 2 years since Megan left. Have you thought about having a woman in your life again?" I felt my face heat up at her question. Honestly, until recently, I hadn't really thought about it. I guess I was still a bit raw from everything. "You said, until recently, has something changed?" she asked, looking amused. I fumbled over my words. "Well, I guess maybe seeing you." A sly smile spread across her face. She set her glass down, then reached behind her back, and before I knew it, her bikini top floated to the surface. My mouth fell open as she rose up slightly, her eyes locked on mine. "Was it seeing me like this?" she whispered. I felt my heart race, and I whispered back, "Yes, oh, Laura." She slid over to me, parting her legs and straddling my lap, her arms wrapping around my neck. My hands instinctively moved to her waist as we locked into a deep, passionate kiss. All the feelings I'd been suppressing for the last year surged to the surface. That night, Laura and I shared an intimacy that went beyond anything I had experienced. We both had been through heartbreak, and somehow, we found comfort and passion in each other's arms. The next morning, I woke up with her beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. "Good morning, beautiful," I said softly. She smiled, snuggling closer. "Good morning, handsome." The night we had spent together felt natural, and as we got up to start the day, everything felt right. Laura and I spent the next 2 weeks enjoying each other's company and finally addressing the feelings we both had. When it was time to pick up the girls from camp, we knew we needed to talk to them. We decided to be upfront with them about our relationship and see how they felt. We picked up the girls together, and as we continuing from where we left off picked up the girls together, they seemed ecstatic to see us both. The car ride home was filled with stories about their camp experiences, and the girls were so full of energy that Laura and I decided to wait until we were all back home to talk to them. Once we arrived, the girls were still buzzing with excitement, barely pausing to unpack their bags before rushing to tell us more about camp. After they had calmed down a bit, Laura and I exchanged glances, and I gently cleared my throat to get their attention. "Sophie, Chloe," I began, "Laura and I have something we'd like to talk to you about." The girls looked at us with curiosity, their chatter quieting down. Laura reached for my hand, and I felt reassured by her touch. "Over the past year, we've spent a lot of time together as a family," Laura said, smiling warmly at the girls. "And we've come to realize that we care for each other very deeply. Ethan and I, we're in love." Sophie and Chloe looked at each other and then at us, smiles breaking across their faces. "So, you're going to be, like, boyfriend and girlfriend?" Chloe asked, grinning. "Something like that," I said, smiling. "We're going to take things one step at a time, but we wanted to make sure you both were okay with it. This would mean Laura and Chloe might eventually move in with us permanently." The girls' reactions were even more enthusiastic than I could have hoped for. Sophie squealed and hugged Chloe, and they both launched themselves at Laura and me. "Oh my gosh, that would be amazing!" Sophie exclaimed. "I mean, Chloe and I are practically sisters already." Chloe nodded, beaming. I love that idea. And I already think of you as my dad, Ethan. Hearing her say that brought tears to my eyes, and I pulled her into a tight hug. Chloe, it would be an honor. That night, our newly blended family celebrated by ordering pizza and watching movies together, filling the house with laughter and joy. It felt like everything was finally falling into place, and I couldn't have been happier. Over the next few months, Laura and Chloe gradually transitioned into our home. We took time to rearrange the house so everyone had their own space and a say in how things were organized. Laura put her house on the market, and it sold quickly, adding a nice nest egg that we set aside for the girls' college funds. Life settled into a new routine that felt effortless and right. Laura and I balanced our work lives and our family life, supporting each other through the ups and downs of parenting two teenage girls. Sophie and Chloe became inseparable, sharing everything from school projects to inside jokes. It was clear that they were not just best friends but sisters in every way that mattered. One evening, about 6 months after Laura and Chloe had officially moved in, I decided to make everything official. I took Laura out for a quiet dinner, just the two of us. As we walked along the pier after dinner, with the city lights reflecting off the water, I stopped, holding her hands in mine. Laura, you've brought so much light into my life. You're not only my best friend but also my partner, and I can't imagine my life without you by my side. Will you marry me? Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, whispering, "Yes, Ethan, yes." We embraced, sealing our commitment with a kiss, feeling that this moment was as much for us as it was for our two daughters, who had made this journey possible by bringing us together. We planned a simple, intimate wedding with just our closest friends and family. Sophie was my proud flower girl, and Chloe stood by Laura's side as her maid of honor. Natalie and Jason were there to celebrate with us, along with a few of my trusted subcontractors and their spouses who had known us both for years. It was a day filled with love, laughter, and new beginnings. We honeymooned in Bali, where we found a perfect balance of relaxation and adventure, exploring the islands by day and basking in each other's company by night. When we returned home, the girls had made a surprise welcome home banner with flowers from the garden, and we celebrated with them, sharing stories from our trip and lots of hugs. From that day on, we embraced life as a complete family. Laura and I made a point of supporting the girls in every way, attending every school event, and helping them navigate the challenges of teenage years. The bond between us grew stronger every day, and both Sophie and Chloe eventually started calling me Dad and Laura Mom without hesitation. A year later, we celebrated our first anniversary as a family by taking the girls to the same spot where I had proposed to Laura, sharing stories, and reminiscing about our journey. Life hadn't always been easy, but we had found each other, and from the ashes of loss and heartbreak, we had built a new beginning, filled with love and family. As I looked around at the three most important people in my life, I knew that we had something truly special, something that would last a lifetime. From heartbreak to healing and from despair to a second chance at love, this story proves that even in our darkest moments, hope can shine through. What do you think about finding love and family in unexpected places? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that inspire.